What do editors do in manga or webtoon serializations? Do they have the final say in your project? How involved are they? Well, today I'm going to be teaching you guys all about manga and webtoon editors. But for those of you guys who are new to my channel, I'm Brandon Chen. I'm an author of novels, manga, webtoons, and narrative video games. And I have serializations with publishers such as Webtoon, Tapas, and Voice Me, as well as several others. And so part of what I do as an author is I'm pumping out weekly serializations, and thus I need to work with editors to make sure that the quality of my projects is not garbage. Editors, for those of you guys who are not familiar, are the individuals that work on behalf of the publisher that oversee your project. They leave feedback, and ultimately they're the ones that have the go button before your episode or chapter is allowed to be published to the public. They're the gateway between the publisher and the mangaka or author. So before we start, make sure to smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm and subscribe and hit the bell notification if you haven't to be updated on when I put out new mangaka or webtoon content. And also ask me questions in the comments. You never know when I might make a video such as this one to answer your questions. Anyway, so how hands-on an editor is with a project depends completely on the publisher and the editor themselves. So in Japan, the editor might have a lot more of a hands-on approach versus, like, in my experience, webtoon editors are more hands-off and give you a lot more freedom. In Japan, they're just a lot more strict, so they might have a scenario where they'll make you redo an entire manga name. And if you don't know what a manga name, that's a manga storyboard. Japanese editors can block your ideas if they don't think that they're good, and they're just overall kind of just harsher, in my opinion, just like as editors. Webtoons, on the other hand, in my experience, have been a lot more lenient. They definitely give feedback and advice for you to improve your work, but they're by no means like forcing you to take action on all that feedback. But as an author, you know, in order to build trust between you and the editor and the publisher, you know, I would definitely consider taking all that feedback into account. But they're not holding a gun to your head and saying, hey, you can't publish unless you do these things. But in general, just like it's good to, but in general, you know, as an author, it's good to have, but in general, you know, it's important to have a good relationship between you and your editor. Now, I definitely recommend that all of you guys check out the series. It's a manga series and also an anime called Bakuman. I'll have a link to the manga in the description if you're interested in checking out like the manga volumes. It's one of my favorite series by the duo who did Death Note, and it pretty much details what the manga editorial process is like, especially at, you know, publishers like Shonen Jump. But yeah, in manga, editors can kind of be like the gatekeepers. Gatekeepers is a very aggressive word, but they're the keepers at the gate between you as the author and publication. Whereas webtoons, it feels like, you know, the editors are more like partners. They're more like partners that is there to kind of nudge your creativity in the right direction to becoming better. Now there are downsides to both. On one hand, manga editors are typically very experienced. They understand story very well. They understand what does well in the manga industry, but they're not always right. It's impossible to be right and to know what's gonna hit with the audience, right? So if they're blocking an idea that a mangaka has, for example, or if they're pushing them in a certain direction with their story, with their characters, and maybe that's not the right direction, but the editor's forcing the mangaka to take that feedback, then that can really inhibit creativity. Right? It can inhibit your creativity. It can potentially push the manga in the wrong direction if the editor is not correct. So that strictness in the manga industry, in my opinion, can sometimes be a cripple. However, the leniency of webtoon editors can also be a cripple on its own as well, because if you have an author who has an ego, and a lot of authors and writers and artists have egos, and they decide to ignore editorial feedback without like discussing or having conversations, then that could potentially throw the project into a downward spiral as well, because no author is perfect. You know, sure, there's been self-published projects that do fantastic and do awesome, but it's always good to have another pair of eyes on your project to give you that outside feedback. Usually even self-published authors have beta readers or you know, just feedback from the audience that they take into account with their work, right? So an author who doesn't listen to feedback is usually just not going to do well. unless they're like a mad genius, which very rare. Most of us aren't mad geniuses. So I think just in general, when you're working with your editor, it's a fine balance between knowing when to stand your ground with regards to your creative process, and also listening to feedback and taking, you know, other people's ideas into account and using it to better your story and better your craft. Editors are usually very experienced within their fields, and so, you know, their feedback in particular is extremely valuable and essential to the success of a serialization. So, you know, always take that into account. Now, how involved are editors? Editors for both manga and webtoons are involved at every step of the serialization process, and that's particularly the case at the start of a serialization. It might not be the case if they've done like 50 or so chapters together. If you don't know what the process of delivering, you know, a webtoon or manga is, you know, I'd definitely check out this video on how to make webtoons or manhwa. I'll put a link somewhere here or here somewhere. But yeah, editors are pretty much approving and checking every step of the comic development process. And they work hard because they're always approving these storyboards, inks, colors, whatever it is. And they're doing that for panels that, you know, are coming from multiple series and serializations that are happening weekly. So that is just a lot of work. You know, for manga, typically the editors will be pretty involved like continuously throughout the entire serialization. But for webtoons, from my experience on webtoons, you know, this depends on publisher to publisher. Some of them take that manga approach where they're still involved even after chapter 50, season 2, whatever it is, and they're still involved with the you know, approving the inks and colors or whatever it is. But, you know, for some publishers also in the webtoon side, they can get more hands-off later as you start to build that trust with your editor, and eventually it's just reaches a point where you're just delivering the storyboards that they know what, you know, it's going to look like, and then you deliver a finished episode, and then they can give some feedback on that. And the reason for that is because usually after working with an editor for long enough, you kind of know what that editor is looking for. But for manga, they're pretty involved throughout. And yeah, so editors are very essential to the success of a serialization, right? Many mangaka attribute a lot of their success to editors. You know, for example, Naruto. Sasuke Uchiha, the second main character of the entire series, would not exist if the editor didn't say, hey, Naruto should have a rival. So without Kishimoto's editor, we would not have the Naruto Sasuke kind of dynamic, you know, and it's interesting because these editors will suggest small things like, hey, maybe you should add a rival. And those can snowball over time into these massive story or character building things that really shape your series. Anyway, that is all for this week's video. If you're just, you know, anyway, that's all for this week's video. If you're interested in learning on how to write for manga as well, I actually created a class that takes you from beginning to end, from creating a story idea all the way to finishing a storyboard and your finished script that you can hand off to an artist. I have a link in the description for the whole class if you're interested in that. So definitely check that out. And also, yeah, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll catch you guys on next week's video. Hopefully this was helpful. Peace.